Right, so we are in this section on the right. And we're working our way through these slides. And this week now you will be able to work on both of these labs, and you obviously take them in the left to right order. So let's pick up the story in the slides.
Dermot, just a quick question. Both of these labs are due for, well, we should have them done for this week, is it?
If you're worried about submitting stuff now, which I imagine, is that where you're coming from?
It's just more so to stay on track, because I plan my work out, so I just want to know if these should be done by this week, realistically.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say yes, you should have them done, let's say, for this time next week.
Okay. Yeah.
Because in next week's lab, we'll start developing the movies app that I demoed to you back in week 1. And that'll roll on then for 4 weeks. And it's that movies app that is what you will be submitting as your lab work for this part of the module. But the direct answer to your question is, yeah, have both of these done, as I say, by this time next week. That would be target.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. So as I said, we're working our way through these slides. So I think I got as far as slide 13 I have in my notes. Yeah. So what we can say now about a React component. React is all about developing components, and a React component is syntactically, it's a JavaScript function, and that function returns JSX, and JSX is the syntax that we use for describing the UI of our component. In other words, how it displays or renders in the browser. The component will obviously, as we'll see in future lectures, will have behavior as well. Behavior is how the component reacts when the user interacts with it. And we will implement that behavior in plain old JavaScript. Right, so that's kind of where we're at. And we had a very simple example of a component last week, which just displayed a list of programming languages, if you remember, and it had a header with some styling in it. Now, there are obviously lots of tools available to us when we're doing React development. Arguably, 2 of them have kind of emerged as the leaders. One is called Create React App. And as its name kind of suggests, it's a tool, it's a command line tool for creating React applications. And I'm just listing there the kind of features that come with it. It's pretty standard kind of stuff, really, when you're doing any web development. The first thing this Create React App tool will do is it will generate a default kind of folder structure for your React project. In other words, it'll perform scaffolding. You'll also stick in some standard initialization files with actual code in them. The second thing is it comes with its own web server. Now, the only type of web server we've been using up to now is the live server plugin that came with VS Code, but that was just a bog standard web server. The web server that comes with Create React App has lots of tooling built into it, in particular tooling that will perform transpilation of your JavaScript code as you're developing and editing and saving files. So the experience will be, we'll start up this development web server, and we will program away our source code files. And as we are saving files, the server will detect that and it will retranspile the code that we've just updated, and it will send the updated code straight down to a browser tab. When you start up the server, it automatically opens up a browser tab. So you get this kind of immediate kind of feedback from your development. You're doing your development, you're saving changes, you're flipping over to the browser, and you're seeing what change has that caused in the browsers, how the browser actually displays my app. That's what we call live reloading. The third point there is eventually you will want to deploy your React app to some sort of cloud service, and you need what's called a bundler or builder tool to do that. These bundler tools, essentially what they do is they take all of the JavaScript files that make up your application, compress them into one single JavaScript bundle, and also transpiles all the code. And then that bundle is what is sent to an ordinary user's browser when they try and use your application. But all of that bundling and live retranspilation and live reloading, that's all being done in the background. We really don't need to worry about it. So that's Create React App. We'll be using that throughout from this week on, really. The second tool then is a tool for developing individual components. What's nice about this tool called Storybook is it's nice that you can actually develop a component in complete isolation of an application. You don't have to worry about the environment that the component is running in, the environment being the actual an application. So Storybook, we're saying there, is a development environment for individual React components. And arguably, it enables you to develop more reusable components because your focus is completely on the component rather than an app as such, which is a kind of a bigger beast. And as well, arguably, you develop components more speedily than you would if you had to always think about, well, how am I going to stitch this component into an app in order to see how the component is actually rendering. When you're developing a component, you're only interested in, is this component working properly for me? Is its behavior working? Is it rendering or displaying properly? You don't really want to have to worry about how do I stitch it into an application. And Storybook allows you to do all of that. I'm just going to focus on Storybook for a little bit. Storybook comes as just a separate library, if you like. So you install it like you install all Node libraries using NPM. And it has two parts to it. It as well has its own web server. And this web server does a lot of what the web server associated with the other tool does, in that it performs live retranspilation of your component code, and it sends that update down to a browser tab and shows you how the component renders. So a lot of commonality between the server that comes with Storybook and the server that comes with the Create React App tool. Secondly, Storybook has its own browser-based user interface. And that user interface looks like this. So when you start up the Storybook server, essentially what it does is it looks through your code for all of the components that you have developed, and it opens up a browser tab. And on the left, as we see there, on the left, it will list all of the individual components that you currently have in the project that you're working on. And these components are hyperlinked. And if you click on them, it will show you how that component renders on the right-hand side. So that's the user interface side of the Storybook tool. Because as I said now, with Storybook, you're kind of working on components individually. So you don't have an app to stitch them into. So Storybook kind of takes care of giving you this type of user interface to help you along. You might wonder, where do they get the name Storybook from? It actually comes from the area of user requirements analysis. in systems development. I don't know if you did any studying on user requirements analysis or not. I won't talk about it in that context. I'll give you a more targeted explanation of what the notion of a story is in React world. So if you've got a component, it may, just by the way, now a component typically, a component is really about rendering data on the screen. It'll add some styling to it, and it may add some extra stuff as well. But essentially, a component is about rendering data, and typically that data comes from a web API. But the data I'm saying there may have several states, and each state might affect how the component renders on the screen. So, and each state is termed a story. So to try and put some meaning to this now, so the last day we had a component that displayed a list of programming languages, and it had a header as well. Now, okay, in the component in the implementation of that component that I showed you, the list of languages was hard-coded, but let's imagine we could pass the languages into the component as data. We'll see how to do that in a while. So now my component, which I'm just calling dynamic languages, it receives as data an array of language names, programming language names. And that array could be of varying sizes. And I've decided as part of this component's how it should display or render in the screen, I have decided that if it receives an array of 5 or less languages, then it should render as I showed you the last day. It should just list those languages with the appropriate header. If it receives an array that's empty, then rather than displaying nothing, it should display a message saying no languages. And thirdly, if it receives an array of more than 5 languages, then it should display the first 5 followed by some sort of a more button. And if you click the more button, it displays the next 5. And if you click the more button again, it displays the next 5 after that. So I've decided in my mind, that's how I want this component to behave and render on the browser. Now, to go back to this notion of stories and states, based on that description that I've just given you, we would say that this component has 3 separate stories associated with it. And I've just arbitrarily given those stories names, and I've described them there to you a moment ago. So the default story I've decided is the one where it receives 5 or less. Boundary is none, and exceptional when it receives more. And I've also told you that the component actually renders or displays slightly differently depending on which of these 3 states the data that it receives is in. So that's what, and when you're developing more advanced components, this is the kind of stuff that you have to decide on when you're designing your components. I'm saying up here that these stories that you come up with are part of the design of a component. Now, I'll be honest to say that we won't necessarily get into having components with lots of stories in them, but we will use Storybook at the same time, though, to help us ensure that a component is rendering properly. In the majority of cases, our components will just have one story. So, but that's where the term story comes from. And so if you've got a component now and you've decided I want to have 3 separate stories or states associated with it, then you'd like that reflected in the Storybook UI. And so this is how Storybook would actually help you along with that. So not only would it list the components, but it'll show the states or stories associated with that component underneath them. And now these are clickable here. And if you click on them, it will show you how the component will render for that particular story. So here's my exceptional story, as I called it. You can give these any name you want to. And I've clicked on exceptional, and yeah, that's how I want my component to behave or to look. It's displaying 5, and I've got my more link down here. As you'll see now in a moment, we actually have to write these stories. We have to implement them or code them. The storybook doesn't magically come up with this for you. You've got to provide it with the stories. So not only are you implementing the component, you're also implementing the stories. And then our storybook will show you is whether your stories are actually rendering the way you want them to. If you've got a large application and we're talking about 100 components plus within an app, then just having a long list of components appearing here on the left is not great. It would be nice if we could group them into categories, and it's up to you, the developer, to come up with the category names. But if you do, then you can get this effect from Storybook. You can actually see the category name, the components in that category. Again, you've got to indicate to Storybook what are the category names and which components come under which category. It's quite easy to do that, actually. Now, before I show you how to implement stories, there's a particular, you implement them in JavaScript. It's just JavaScript syntax. So there's not a new syntax for it, but you do have to follow a particular pattern, all right? But before I can do that, I need to just go off on a sidetrack for a second and explain how JavaScript supports modularization. Modularization is this idea of breaking up your code base into individual modules, files typically. We know how to do it in JavaScript, and we know how to import and export in JavaScript. In Java, sorry. How do we do it in JavaScript? So again, there's a kind of a pre-ES6 and a post-ES6 way of doing it. We don't really care about the pre-ES6 way because we'd only be doing it in post-ES6. There are two options available to you. So let's just be clear now. All I'm saying here is I want to break up my entire JavaScript code base into a number of files. Maybe each file has an implementation of a function, or maybe a couple of functions, or a file might have an implementation of a class, or a file might have declaration of some global objects that we want to share across the place. We want to be able to access each file we would refer to as a module, and we want to be able to access modules from other modules. So the way you do it in ES6 is you have two facilities available to you. One is called default exports and the other is called name exports. And you can actually combine these together to get mixed exports. Here's an example on the left. So what I'm trying to get across here is, let's suppose I have two separate files. I've called one lib.js and the other is called bar.js. Inside of lib.js, I have some function implementation, but I want to make this function available to other files. And also this function is the only thing that I have declared inside in this file. So the first thing I need to do is I need to export this function. So I just use my keyword export. And because it's the only thing that I'm exporting, I add on this extra token, default. So I would say that this is the default export from this file. Then in the other file, I have my import statement. I'm importing from this file. This is a path name now, by the way, a relative path name. So it looks like bar.js and lib.js happen to be in the same folder, but they may not be. So this is a relative path name. Now you'll notice I didn't give the function any name up here, but because it's so I can actually call it anything I wanted down here. So my func is going to be a reference to the function that I've declared up here, and I can just invoke it any way I want to. That's default exports. Named exports then is when you've got a file that wants to be able to export a number of different entities, if you like. So it looks like I want to be able to export this string, I want to export a const, I want to export a function, and I want to export a class. And I have given each of these things specific names now. So I've got these are what we call named exports, as in up here. And in another file, then I want to use some of them. In this file here, it looks like I'm only interested in the function and the string that were defined above. So here's the import statement syntax. You've got to wrap the things that you want to import in curly braces. And we have our from keyword and we have our relative path name to the file. Okay, and then I'm just using them down here as normal. So in order to, in this file here, in order to use the certain entities from the file above, I do need to know what they were called up here. And you can mix these together. You can have, this file here could have a default export as well as these named exports. So let's go back to Storybook. How do we write our stories? The first thing is, and it's only a convention, the Storybook files by convention has this extension, .stories.js. You would have a Storybook file implementation per component. And by the way, it's convention as well to only have one component implementation per file. So that means we would have one stories file per component. And this is the pattern that your stories implementation needs to follow. So on top, of course, I'm importing React. And I'm importing, in this case, this is the component now that I'm writing stories for. So this is my dynamic languages component that I was describing earlier on. So the first thing you've got to do is you've got to declare a default export, and the default export has to be an object. This is prescribed by Storybook. That object has to have a key called title and a key called component. Title is assigned a string, and typically you would put in here the name of the component in just English, doesn't have to match the actual component name. The component key, it has to be assigned the actual component itself. So this here is a reference to what I'm importing up here. So that's telling Storybook, essentially Storybook uses this object to control how it displays its UI. If I just go back for a second, it uses it to control this here. Then I have as named exports each of my individual stories. Now you remember I came up with 3 stories for my dynamic languages component, and I arbitrarily called those stories default, exceptional, and boundary. You can give them any names you want to. So this looks like the implementation of the default story, which is when the component receives an array of 5 or less languages. This story has to be implemented as a function. I'm using the arrow style, but it doesn't have to be. And in the body of the function, critically, you must return an instance of the component that that story relates to. And as we saw the last day, we can now actually refer to a component using this kind of HTML-like syntax. Now, for now, don't worry about it, but this is how we actually can pass data down into a component. We will see this formally in a few slides down the line. So here I'm actually just creating an ordinary array with my list of language names. And this is how I actually pass them into the component. And again, don't worry about how does the component actually access this. We'll see that in a while. For now, all we're interested in is this is how you implement the story. You've got to have this standard default export object at the top, and then each story is implemented as a function, and that function has to return an instance of that story, an instance of that component, sorry. I've left out the detail for the other 2 stories because we're not interested in that detail at this stage. We're only interested in the overall structure of how you code these stories. We'll just pause for a second if there are any questions. No, the only reason this slide is included in the list is because the way you implement stories has changed slightly in the last few years. So essentially, if you start Googling around Storybook and you start seeing stories implemented using this type of syntax, then I'm suggesting you should stop straight away, because you are reading an article that is too old. So it could be, as recent as 3 years ago. That's too old. So this was the old coding style, and it was quite cumbersome and long-winded. The new style, which is on the previous slide, is much cleaner. Now, I said that you can group your components into categories or groupings. And how do you actually tell Storybook that a component belongs to a particular group? Well, it's actually in the title part of this object that you create. And the slash there is significant. The Storybook server uses this to indicate that this component is part of this group or category name. So you can see I've got another excerpt from another component file here, and it also has group A / whatever the component is. So that slash there is significant. And you can actually have subgroupings and subgroupings. You would just keep on using the slash in this actual string. So that there, because there's a slash in it, that's what allows the Storybook server to, if I just go back, to come up with this sort of displaying of your list of components in the Storybook UI. So that's all about Storybook. Really, there's not a whole lot to it. Once you implement a couple of stories, then it's pretty much easy to use, really. It's not meant to be the hard part. The hard part is meant to be implementing the components. And take it from me, you'll get the hang of Storybook once you have, I would imagine, just one lab doing it, which is going to be the first of this week's labs, as it turns out. I want to go back to components, though, and talk about some fundamentals associated with components. The component that we've seen so far, sorry, just before I mention that, the screenshot that you're seeing here now is the basis for the first lab this week. And when you go into that lab, there'll be an archive. And when you download it and unzip it, what you get is what you see on the right there. And I'll just import it into my own VS Code. So what I've got is in my source, I'm not really interested in an app now, I'm just interested in individual components. So, sorry, yes. I've got a components folder and I've got a stories folder. And there's no prizes for guessing. In my components folder, I have implementation of various components. And you can see from the names here that I've got samples, which I would want to talk through in this lecture. And then there's an exercises folder. And this is what you will need to implement in the lab. And you can see each of the files here, they're all empty, right? You have to actually implement the JSX accordingly. So I just want to walk through the samples, and in the stories folder, it's also broken down similarly. It has a samples and exercises subfolders, and surprise, surprise, these are the stories associated with these components. So that's the idea as well. Whenever you're using Storybook, there is some high-level configuration that you need to tell Storybook server about. We tend to put that in a folder called .storybook. You will never need to go near this, but it does have to be there because the Storybook server uses it. Essentially inside here, you're telling the Storybook server where to find your story implementations. And other than that, it's pretty straightforward. So just be aware of it, that it's there, but you never need to go in there. Okay, so I want to step through the sample components and their associated stories so that you can then do the exercises. That's the plan. The first thing we want to be able to do is to embed variables in our JSX. The JSX that we've seen so far has been completely static. And the syntax that you use is you wrap the variable. In fact, it can be more than just a variable reference. It can be an entire expression. If you wrap it in curly braces within your JSX syntax, then whatever is inside the curly braces will be evaluated, and the result of that evaluation will be inserted into your overall output JSX, if you like. So if we look at the sample down here, it's my kind of component that displays a list of languages again. But whereas previously I had the languages hard coded down here, now I've just made it slightly better in that I've put my languages into an ordinary JavaScript array. And down here, then I am referencing elements within that array. But I have to wrap the references in the curly braces as I'm doing here. So at runtime, what the runtime will do is it will first of all evaluate this expression, and the result of that evaluation is then what will be assigned to, in this case, the li element. I'm doing something just slightly fancier up here in that I am using string templating, which we've seen before. And so at runtime now, this string template is going to be evaluated, and the result of that evaluation is going to be my H1 header. Right? So this curly brace here, which is matching this curly brace here, those two curly braces are mandated by JSX. The curly braces that are inside here, they're just part of the string templating syntax that we saw associated with JavaScript last week. So by using curly braces within your JSX, you can have the effect of making your JSX slightly more flexible, if you like. And as I'm saying up here, you can have, do I say it? Yeah, I'm saying you can have any valid JS expression within your curly braces. So, you could even call a function from here, and the result of the function returned by the function is what will be inserted into your actual HTML, if you like. So the illustration of that, so we're told to look at samples 02, blah, blah. So let's do that. So there's two things we need to look at. We need to look at the component, and we need to look at the associated story. So we've really already seen the component, but let's just, so it's in the samples, and it's this one. No, it's not, it's this one, sorry, 02. Isn't it 02 it said? Yeah, 02. 01 was what we really had the last day. I just put that in for completeness. So this is what the code that I've just shown you. For simplicity and convenience, I've actually decided to call every component, name every component demo, which wouldn't be the norm, but that's just a convenience. So there's my component anyway, which you've already seen. And the story associated with that is here. Now, I guess at this stage, what I should have said to you was, how do I start up my Storybook server? I'll do it like this. So this is going to have the effect of starting my Storybook server. And what the server will do is it will chew up all of this code, your components, your stories, etc., and transpile everything, open up a browser tab, and suddenly it will give you that. So this is the UI that I was showing you there a while back. And we are in samples. Okay. So on the left, it seems to be telling me that there are two groups of components. One is called exercises, the other is called samples. How did it work that out? It worked it out if we look at the component, the story that we're actually looking at. This is the story that associated with the demonstrating embedded vars. And you can see here, see the way at the title I have samples / something. Okay, so that there is what allowed it to come up with samples as my category. This is being, okay, it's not a component name. You can have any kind of string you want to, but I'm using more meaningful strings and a default story within that. So I call the story basic rather than default. That's okay. It got basic from it actually got basic from here. So here's my story implementation, and it's pretty trivial. So that's demonstrating embedding variables or expressions within your JSX. The next thing I'd like to do is to make my components reusable. The component that I've just shown you now is completely enclosed, and you cannot pass anything into it. The list of languages, okay, they're declared in an array, but they're still not modifiable from outside the component. We'd like them to be thus, and another way of saying that is we'd like our component to be reusable. In other words, we'd like to parameterize a component. And the term we use in React is props. Props, I guess, is short for properties. So we'd like to be able to pass properties or parameters into a component from the outside. And so two questions arise. One is, A, how do we syntactically express that? And secondly, how does the component access those parameters or properties that we're passing into it? So in terms of the first question, this is the syntax that you use for passing parameters or properties into a component. We actually saw it there a few slides back, and I said to you that I would give you a formal explanation of that syntax. So this is it here. Of course, part of the design part of a component is deciding what parameters are appropriate for a component, what name do I want to give those parameters, and what kind of values do those parameters have. That's part of the design process. We needn't get into that now. So this is the syntax for, and it's very HTML-like, it's kind of key value pairs. That's how we pass parameters into a component. Here then I'm explaining how you access those parameters. So it turns out that at runtime, the React engine creates an object, and that object contains these key value pairs that you're passing into the component. By convention, the object is called the props object, and that props object is passed as a parameter to your component function implementation. It's always there, even if you've got a component that doesn't have any explicit parameters or properties in its usage. This props object would exist anyway, because it does have some default attributes that will become useful later on. So here's my props object that's passed in to my component by React for me. and it is an object, and I just dereference particular keys within that object in order to get at the value associated with a particular property. So prop1 name, that expression is going to evaluate to whatever value you have assigned to that property when you are using the component. Note as well that you have to wrap the value in these curly braces, which is part of the JS syntax as we saw now from the previous example. If you leave out those curly braces, you get a very different outcome. Props, I'm saying, are immutable. You cannot, within a component, you cannot change the value associated with a prop. Syntactically, it will allow you to do it, but if you then do a console.log of the prop after you've changed it, or you think you've changed it, it'll still console.log the value that was passed in from the outside. So it's immutable, and I'm saying it's part of a component's design. To see an example of that, we're told to move on to the 03 sample. Now, in this case, I'm going to look at the story first, because what I want to pass in as my props, I'm sticking with the same kind of context, this component that renders a list of languages, but I want to pass in the list of languages as a prop. And I also want to pass in what the header text will be. So if I look at the story first, so it's 03. And this is fairly standard. I only have one story. Here I'm declaring my array of languages. Here I'm declaring the classification of those languages. And here I'm calling my component, which I've imported at the top, which we've yet to see. Here's my component, and here I'm passing my data into my component. I can call these anything I want to, but they are meaningful names, I think. And now if I look at the component itself, it's 03 samples. So here we go. I am actually, if we look at the list first, I'm dereferencing my props object, which is passed in here. Props.languages. Languages, you remember, is what I called the array, as in I called it languages here. And I'm just subscripting into it. Similarly, up here, I'm constructing using string templating again, but the actual header is being passed in as a prop. And how does that component render? Well, Storybook will tell me. If I click on the relevant one, which is the 03 one here, okay, looks good. And just to show you the kind of dynamic reloading aspect of Storybook, if I go back to my story, and let's say I change this to, or typically you wouldn't be changing the data, you'd be changing the actual component. But if I just go the language go, save, and it's updated in the UI. So that's this notion of props, passing data into a component to make it more reusable. Off on a tangent now for a second again, some JavaScript stuff that we need to remind ourselves about, really. The first thing is about arrow functions. You remember that a lot of the syntax associated with arrow functions is optional. So these two arrow function declarations are the same. Okay, I'm not going to go over that in detail now. I've already kind of explained that to you. The second thing we need to remind ourselves about is the array map function, which we are very familiar with. So I don't need to explain this to you now. I'm just reminding you of it. The third thing we don't necessarily know about, but what I'm saying here is this is a valid assignment statement. I can assign some JSX, albeit very static JSX, so which is not significant. I can assign JSX to a variable. And the question I'm asking is, well, I wonder why is that possible? And the answer is, if you can remember back to how this is actually transpiled, or what it transpiles to. And what it transpiles to is this. So really all we're doing here is we're invoking this method of the React object, and whatever that method returns, that's what we're assigning to the variable. We never looked at what it returns. We don't really care. It's probably going to be an object of some type. And we're just assigning an object to a variable. But for now, this is a valid assignment statement. So taking on board all of those things, the next thing I want to demonstrate in terms of basic component coding is how to implement iteration in our components. So the objective here is that we want to generate an array of components or an array of JSX elements from a data array. Now we're told to look at sample 04. This is kind of what we want to actually be able to generate. Okay, this is the actual HTML that we want to generate. It looks like we want to generate a collection of LI elements, where the LI elements have information relating to whatever, but it's a collection of things. So sample 4 is going to show us how to do that. And if we look again at the story first, so I've just changed the context for no particular reason. Maybe I should show you how the component renders first, actually. Sample 4. Okay, it's generating, again, in this time, this case, an array of single page app frameworks. These are hyperlinks, it looks like. I won't click on them, but each of these hyperlinks will take me to the home page of the particular framework, and I've got a header as before. And it's very like the previous examples, but just slightly different context. That's how the component renders. Here's my story. So here's my array with information about single page app frameworks, and I've just arbitrarily come up with this structure. Let's not get into that. I've got, this is an ordinary string. Here's the component that we've yet to look at. We're passing in our objects, which I've called frameworks, and we're passing in the string. Now, inside in this component, what I wanted to do is I wanted to generate what we saw on the screen there in the browser. So if we look at the component, this is how I'm actually going to do it. I'm not going to hard code it as I did previously. So you can see the key part of this implementation is going on up here. So I'm going props.frameworks. Now that expression is going to evaluate to the array of frameworks. Let me just leave that open. And I want to go back to the story. So frameworks here is an array. I should have done it accidentally. I think I might have said it was an object. It's an array. It's an array of objects. Sorry. So in my component, I'm iterating over the array using the map array method. Here's the callback that I'm passing to map. So for any particular invocation, F is going to be referring to one of the objects. Sorry, one of these objects. Just for now, index is, as we know, the index position, and the function is returning an LI element. For now, forget about what this key is all about. I'll talk about that the next day. But what map is doing is it's iterating over this array, and it's putting the output into a new array. And that new array, I can tell based on the body of the callback function, that array will be an array of LI elements. That is quite unusual. But then again, I've also told you that what this kind of transpires to. So, but it's best that you think about it in pure JSX terms. So it seems that it is acceptable to have an array of JSX elements. And so that means down here, when I am trying to, I'm passing that array to a UL element, if you like, we know now that this list here is going to expand into an array of these things. And it makes, from a HTML point of view, makes sense to have a list or collection of LI elements wrapped by a UL element. So from a HTML perspective, that when it evaluates at runtime, that will all evaluate to something sensible. And what it will evaluate to is, you know, something like this. Now, this pattern of using map to map over your data array, this is my data array, and to produce an array of JSX elements, or it could even be an array of components. That is a pattern that we will see used quite a lot throughout this part of the module. So you do need to be comfortable seeing this this pattern in the code that I give you. A lot going on there, but you need to grapple with that. So that's showing us how to generate an array of, in this case, JSX elements, but as I said, it could be an array of components from a data array. We use the array map function to do it for us. I said I'd explain what is this about. This is more a convenience for React. Each element, each entry in your array has to have a unique key, or should have a unique key. And that's what you're doing here. It looks like I'm deciding that the index position of the particular source data element, that's being used as my key. Key here is technically it's a prop, but it's a prop that's really defined and used by the React runtime engine. So other than that, you needn't worry about this. I could have actually left that out, but if I did, then I would get a warning from React telling me you're better off having individual, each element in an array of JSX elements should have unique keys.